So, a few years ago, I was reading a book. It wasn't actually a very good book, I wouldn't recommend it, but it had a funny story in it, about a Christian leader who accidentally ended up, because he went to the wrong venue for his meeting, in a planning meeting for a gay rodeo. And he was sitting near the front, so he was too embarrassed to leave, and ended up sitting through the whole meeting. Well, it was a good lesson for him, I think, because he was like, well, this isn't some sort of den of terrible iniquity here. It's actually quite a normal meeting. In fact, he said, it was not totally different from the leadership meetings of the church that I was at then. A group of men all forcefully saying what they want to happen, but also making excuses as to why they hadn't done the things they promised to do in the last meeting. Just to be clear, that's not our church leadership meetings, they're not like that. I like that story because it was a humble and amusing reflection. And I like it because we read today's passage and perhaps we think of the world out there. That's what he says in the start of the passage. You must not live as the Gentiles do, the nations do, people outside the church. And we might think of whoever we don't like, sensuality and every kind of impurity. But Paul, the writer of this letter to some early Christians, is not giving a dark description of what he calls the Gentile world because he thinks everyone here is really great and everyone out there is really not. People in this room will have very differing views of where the dark places in the world are, whether it's the gay rodeo meeting, nightclubs, a reform party meeting, a green party meeting. Everybody has their own view of where evil lives. But Paul is saying, insisting in the Lord, actually, he says, these Christians need to learn that the way that the Gentile world, the world that doesn't know God, operates, that way of life should not operate within the life of Christians together. The big picture of this book corrects us, really. I find it very interesting. It's really corrected the way that I think about being a Christian. We tend to think that Christianity is about me and God. God saving me. But Ephesians has been teaching us that God has a bigger purpose than that. He saves me so that he can put me into a community of light that displays God's glory and wisdom, a local church. Last week we saw with Josh that churches, these communities of light, need structures. They need people who should lead and teach under God, but that every Christian has a part to play in a community like that, loving each other and speaking the truth. There are no passengers in the church. And God, the Lord of all creation, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, he points to these gatherings of people and says, that displays my wisdom to my enemies. But Paul is saying here in this bit of the passage, none of that will work if we bring the world to church. Because you can go out there today and find people whose experience of what is supposed to display God's wisdom is just like the guy in my story at the start. That I come to gather with people who say they belong to God, and it's just the same as the world. The laziness, the excuses, or worse, the petty rivalries, competition, or worse than that, the actual abuse, but with a religious veneer. We won't work as a church if the people who are given the gift to teach and lead are like that. Actually, we won't be the church we're supposed to be if any of us are like that. Paul says you cannot build a church that honours Jesus if you live out the values of the world in the church. And so that's the first thing that we're going to see. Sorry, I forgot my clicker, so you have to do my slides, I'm afraid. The first thing we're going to see is don't bring your old mind to church. I saw some of my friends this week who also help to lead churches in other bits of the country. And one of them was telling me about a conflict they had got drawn into in their church several years ago. There was a ministry, a thing in their church that involved teaching people, and it was run by very competent people. The church had said, yes, you're godly and you're qualified, we want you to lead that. But someone joined the team whose professional work was in that field. And when they jumped into the team, they of course knew exactly how everything should be done. But the people running the ministry in the church didn't want it to function like a classroom. They were saying, we want to do something different here. So they said, oh, thanks for your ideas, but we don't really want you to implement everything that you bring from your professional life here, because we're doing something a little bit different. Well, the person, after venting a lot to my poor friend, the pastor, who didn't really even have anything to do with it, in the end left the church in what British people would call a strop. And said, I haven't been doing this for 20 years in order to feel humiliated and disrespected. So in a sense, I'm not surprised if that type of thing happens, because I think if you train in any profession nowadays, all of your training is about how you ought to be respected and honoured, and people ought to make a fuss to you and defer to you all the time. That is the way the nations, the Gentiles, work. That's the word Gentiles means here, nations. And Paul is saying, listen, in every culture of the world, at every time, the same things are at play. Every culture of the world is soaked in self-centered ideas. But if you come here, the church exists to glorify Jesus, not you. And so you don't get to say, I'm a well-respected professional, and I will not, have anybody disrespect me. Now, track in the verses how Paul says that comes about. He says, the people in the world, they don't know God because they have futile thinking. Their whole thinking is futile. That must be true, because Paul is saying that the whole purpose of everything in creation is so that everything can be brought under Jesus. If that's not your starting point, but rather something like clever people should be respected, your thinking will be futile. You can't get to the right destination if you don't even set out for it. And listen, everyone can know that everything in creation about Jesus. This is not like, yes, we're very clever for working that out, and people out there are very silly for not realizing. The whole point of Ephesians is to say that revelation comes by grace. Anybody can choose to live their life that way. Anybody's welcome to. But Paul says people have hard hearts. They don't want to live their lives for the glory of Jesus. People separated from God can't aim at the right thing, bringing glory to Jesus. Therefore, their thinking is futile. And therefore, Paul says, in every culture of the world, people lose sense of really what's right and wrong and become greedy for things that are wrong and impure. That's how he describes the cultures of the nations. They decide what matters without reference to Jesus. They center their own feelings and desires. They become greedy to get more and more of what serves them. And just to be clear again, he is not saying the world out there gets everything wrong and we get everything right. He's saying the opposite of that. He's saying, so be careful you do not bring that to church, because you might. Think about that person in my friend's church. They did not think in that moment that the important thing was Jesus' Lordship, and therefore loving and serving and following the people gifted to teach, as we saw last week. They just didn't think that was important. That word, sensuality, that Paul uses, indulging in impurity, we might consider that just to mean something dark and sexual. It includes that, I think. But that's the same. This person in my friend's church had a sense, a feeling, I want to be respected and honoured and even revered, and they were greedy for that feeling, and that disrupted the church. And they didn't learn that from Jesus. They learned that from the nations. And instead of owning that and repenting of it, saying, okay, I'm getting a bit proud and spiky here, and let's glorify Jesus together, they gave themselves over to that feeling, greedy for that feeling, disrupting the beautiful unity that God creates in the church. Listen, if you learn how to live from a culture that has pointless aims and hard hearts and pushes us to be greedy for what we want, that's how you learn to live from. you're not going to glorify Jesus in the church. Don't bring the Gentile man to church. Let me say a few things about this before we move on, just in case you're worried. First, this is not saying that non-Christians don't know anything about anything. So, for example, if you're a Christian surgeon here today, please learn lots of surgery from people who are not Christians. Please do that, because someday you might be operating on me, and I don't think the expertise is here for you to learn how to do that really well. So please do it. Please read books by people who aren't Christians. Please look at the world to see what wisdom is there. You can be an excellent surgeon, though, without knowing Christ. But you can't be a surgeon who glorifies Christ without knowing Christ. Of course you can't. So don't learn how to glorify Christ by following the example of people who don't know Christ. You're not going to learn, for example, how to behave to other Christians in church, I guess, in most operating theatres. Second, I think this is a challenge to this in our place and time particularly. Even 50 years ago, Britain, where we live now, was operating in a broadly Christian moral framework. Now, in some ways that was better, in some ways that was worse than we are now. I think people were still like this, self-seeking, but it was hidden under a sort of Christian culture and Christian language, and there was a lot of hypocrisy. But anyway, the public view is much more, what is right is the type of thing the Bible says is right. Now, that's not true. Now we're actually really visibly encouraged to do what this passage says. To take something about yourself, say, for example, who you're sexually attracted to, and make that a part of your identity. And advertise it to everyone. And reject anybody who doesn't see you in the way you see yourself. That's what we're encouraged to do. Now, sexuality is a complicated issue for nearly everyone, and we're going to think about it Sunday evenings in March, if you're going to come along to that in a few weeks. But Paul is saying, defining yourself by things that are part of your old self, that are greed for something that you desire, that is not what we're doing here. It will not help us build a church. Third, again, he is not simply describing the world out there, he's describing bringing it in here. That church can be full of futile thinking, that we all can come thinking something matters more than honouring Jesus, and be hard-hearted and spiky when somebody points that out, and to lose sensitivity for things that matter because we're just more and more greedy for the things that please us. I've had that conversation with people more times than I would care to remember, where you say, listen, the way you're living, the way you're treating people, it's not honouring to Jesus. And people say, yeah, but I don't get anything out of it, living that way. Or the heart wants what it wants. What is that except learning from the Gentiles to place what you want first? And Paul says, please don't bring that to church. Here's the thing though. You can't just be like that all the time and then switch it off when you walk in the doors here. So this is the second thing we see. Paul says, don't bring the Gentile man to church because you're putting it off in life. There is a man in my normal, rather conservative church where I grew up who used to be a criminal. He had a tattoo on his wrist which marked him out actually as having belonged to a paramilitary organisation, so goodness knows what he'd done before he knew the Lord. But my memory of him was as a lovely, gentle, gracious, quiet, contented saint. I'm sure the life he used to have erupted sometimes. But he demonstrates the truth that you will have found if you hang around church for any length of time, that there are many, many people who come to Jesus and are totally remade. And not in a bad way, but remade to be who they truly can be. As Paul describes it, someone who reflects the God that they love so much. The gospel says you can leave your old self, your messed up desires. You can leave that behind. That's what happens when you become a Christian. I guess if you're a Christian here and someone said to you today, what happens when you become a Christian? You could list a whole lot of things. I became right with God. I was saved from hell. I was adopted into God's family. But here's an important one to think about, not to miss. You were made into an entirely new person when you trusted Jesus. That's why baptism matters so much, and we'll talk more about that next week. It's the most powerful picture we have for that. Now, the old person still remains. He's like that guest at a party when you're dying to go to bed, who just won't leave. That's your old self still hanging around. And that old self, corrupted by deceitful desires, is still vying for control. But you have a new self. You are a new self who can reflect God, who is wholly different. And Paul is saying here, you can choose, once you know Christ, to put that self on. He will not have anybody who's saying, yeah, I'm just an angry person. I'm just a lustful person. I'm just a proud person. Paul's like, could be true of your old self, definitely not true of the new self, so choose to put on the new one. He says, if you have the whole self, new self, put it on. There is still the old you, but put on the new one. The old you, how do you know? This feels very sort of like conceptual. How do I know if it's my old self or my new self? Well, Paul says, the old self desires, its desires are corrupted by what the world has told you. So take it off. The new you will always be operating out of being right with God, being righteous, and being holy, being separate and different. Put on that self. And if you do, like the man in my church, you will begin to be formed in the likeness of the God you love so much. And if you're a Christian, I assume that's what you want. But the decision of which self to put on is yours. Every day, every hour, every moment. Say, for example, sorry, using this example, this is not an example from my life. Say, for example, the person you're married to is annoying you. It happens in our house, but the other way around. And your old self is corrupted by wrong desires. So thinks, this person is annoying me, I should punish them. Or I should show them who is boss. Or I should take my hurt out on them. It's old self. I should be honoured and respected. But in that moment, you can choose the new self. You can think, I'm right with God. You can say, I'm free from the desire to be endlessly honoured. I don't need that. I can offer forgiveness and grace. That's suddenly you're being like God himself, the way he behaves towards us. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't mean become a walkover. God always confronts and calls for repentance, and that might be what's needed in your situation, but he is also always gracious without failing, never taking revenge, never freezing us out. I choose a marriage illustration because here's the truth. Sometimes you can pretend at church. But Paul is saying, if you don't want to bring the Gentile mind to church, you need to decide to put your old self off all the time and put your new self on all the time. Someone once said to me at church, we were sitting chatting in church, and she said to me years ago, she said, you know, at work, I'm known as someone who doesn't put up with stupid people. And I was like, yeah, I could have guessed that from the way you interact with people around here you consider to be stupid. You can't switch. If we want to build God's church, if we want to display God's wisdom, it is a daily thing to put off the old self and put on the new self. Let's take an example. Say you're here at church and someone asks you to serve in some way. You choose. Respond to that out of the old self or the new self. Oh, to be clear, The new self does not always say yes. This is not a sort of advert for serving. The new self says, okay, I'm right with God, so I don't need to impress anyone by saying yes to this. I'm also set apart, so I want to honour God in this request. And I want to, my heart's desire is to be like God to other people. So that's why I'll decide how I respond to this request. The old self is a bit like Phoebe from Friends. Phoebe is my favourite character of Friends. And there's a bit in a Friends episode where Ross says to her, Phoebe, would you like to come to a movie with us? And she said, yeah, I would, but I don't want to. That's what our old self is like. Many people say things like, oh, I'm not really that type of person, or I don't really want to get involved. What they mean is, I don't feel like it. And that is Gentile talk. That's centering how you feel. That's the old self talking. It's even the old self talking if you're like, oh, okay, I'll do it, but inside you're thinking, I'll do it, so I won't look bad. It's the old self. And people just say it. We just think it's normal to justify a godless desire of mine, but it's a tell. If in church you have that interaction, it's a tell about your whole life that you're not putting on your new self at home or at work or by yourself in private. You know, we have stood here this morning and sung, if Christ is mine, I need no more. And Paul says that in verse 20, he's basically saying, you already know about Christ. This is how you learned about him. I assume you know, therefore, if you know about Christ, that putting yourself first and being greedy for more of that is not what you learn from Christ. What you learn from Christ is, if you have him, you don't need anything else. You trusted Jesus because he is the opposite of the way you're behaving if you're being selfish. And so it's an opportunity all the time in life to put on your remade nature, to display the love of the God you love in the way only you can, to say the way of life that comes from that corrupt, messed up nature that I learned from the nations, I want to put that away, to do that all the time and then bring that to church and show us Jesus. Let Jesus change what you think matters. Choose to put on a new self who's safe with God, secure, at rest, different, holy, set apart. The new self who thinks, what I would love is to bring some of God's presence to the people around me. But you won't just be able to switch it on here. Day by day, moment by moment, seeing what goes with the old self and corrupted desire, getting rid of that, and seeing what comes from being safe and set apart from God and putting on that. Well, the last thing we see is a case study in verse 25, honesty. I'm about to tell a story, but I'm not suggesting as a pastoral method. I just want to be clear. Years ago, in the Stone Age, when the internet was new, and you couldn't get the internet on your phone, I mean, what did we do? I don't know. We had to speak to strangers and ask them for directions, that type of thing. You could only get the internet on your computer, desktop computer at home. No one had a laptop either. And my friend got a sort of fancy new desktop, which at that stage looked something like this. And broadband was a new thing, so it was the first time you could really watch moving images on the screen. And he had it all set up in his study. And his friend came round and said to him, well, that's a nice new computer. Do you watch porn on it? No, I just want to be clear, not suggesting that as a pastoral method, that we should all begin having that conversation. But just say he had, which I suspect is not true at all of this person, but just say he had. What would the old self say? Well, the old self, corrupted by the nations, might say, yeah, sure I have. People have needs, why wouldn't I? But also the old self might say in Christian circles, still corrupted by the desire for approval, the old self might lie. Say, definitely not. How could you think such a thing? I would never do that. The new self, being sure of being right with God, whatever sin comes out of your heart. The new self who wants Jesus' grace to be glorified in the church, who wants to live a new, different, separate life. The new self, if they have done the wrong thing, would say yes. I need to be open. I need your help to repent. We turn to their friend and look at them and think, me and him are only right with God through Jesus. That means my own darkest leanings can be exposed. And we can talk about them. Which is why Paul says in verse 25, therefore you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbour. And sometimes I study with interns a book called You Can Change. And one of the things he gets you to do in that book, the author, is to talk about something you really are sinfully led towards, and then try and put into words what you're really desiring in that situation. And it's such an interesting exercise to do, you should try it. And once I was with a group of interns, and we all had to write down what we were desiring when we want something sinful. And we all wrote it down, and I was like, okay, we're all going to read them out. I went first. And then one of them was just like, I can't read this out because I sound like a monster. I was like, go on, spit it out, say anything. He was like, I'm sinfully drawn to anger because I just want everybody to do what I want all the time. There are other interesting answers in that discussion as well, like, I want people to think my outfit looks good and other things like that. But can you see, in that environment, we didn't need to hide what was going on in our hearts because we were saved, righteous, right before God. And actually naming it helps you hate it, helps you turn away. Paul's saying if everything Ephesians says about Jesus is true, we're united to Jesus, safe with him, we do not need to be liars. So don't bring the Gentile mind to church because you're putting on the new self all the time. That means we can be honest. Let me finish by talking about this. In the world that I live in, there's been a lot of documenting of Christian leadership failure. And that makes people nervous about the model Paul talked about looked at last week in church. That the way we grow together in knowing God is for everyone to speak the truth in love, but we only learn to do that in churches with people recognised as able to teach and equip and lead and warn people off wrong values. People are nervous about that because they just think there's so many bad examples of people misuse their position. And that's why this follows next. Because Paul is saying, if you have any influence over other Christians, as a parent, as a friend, or as a leader, you must get rid of the Gentile mind and put on the new self every moment of every day. Because sooner or later, if you feed your old self, he will explode with a vengeance. And the more people you influence, the more painful that will be. And so people like me and other leaders of the church, we too need you to speak the truth in love to us and tell us, put off your old self, put on your new self. As you consider that, you'll be shocked, like my intern group, at the well of how the old self and corrupted desires are still there. If you don't find that, you're just deluding yourself. And you will be tempted to hide or justify those things. But here's the call, to say, I'm right with God through Jesus. I'm set apart to be with God through Jesus. I want to be like God, bring the blessing of being like God to other people. I can speak up. I can tell the truth. And then maybe this verse can be true that Paul has promised. Earlier on in the passage, will come up on the screen. He says, when the church does what we're supposed to do, we may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Each person here wanting to be like God to other people, we can be filled right up to show the world what God is like. But not if we bring the Gentile mind to church.